Welcome back to the Longacres Finance channel, where we talk about dividend growth investing. The stock market is starting to look sour again, with red day followed by red day and no end in sight. The recent Fed announcement and the looming recession are creating a lot of doom and gloom for the market, so I wanted to focus on something positive today in this overall gloomy year. As a dividend investor, a falling market isn't necessarily a bad time if you focus on the positives. With falling share prices, dividend investors are able to dollar cost average into their favorite dividend stocks with a better starting dividend yield. And of course, if you have a portfolio filled with quality dividend-paying companies, it's highly likely your dividend income has not been impacted this year. In fact, it's likely grown through dividend reinvestment and dividend increases. Year to date, 51 out of the 64 Dividend Aristocrats have already announced a dividend increase, which means we are due for 13 more dividend increases in the remainder of the year. Even if the market continues to decline, if you happen to own one of these 13 Dividend Aristocrats, you will very likely see a bump in your dividend income in the coming quarter. Let's take a look at each of these aristocrats and see when we can expect to find out what the next dividend increase will be, and also what type of increase it may be. I'll go through them in alphabetical order, and at the end, I'll talk about all of the dividend increases we have seen this year and how they compare to prior years. First up, we have ADP, Automatic Data Processing, that should announce its dividend increase in early to mid-November. Comparing total dividends paid per calendar year, ADP had a rather low increase in 2021 of just 4.64%. This was their worst increase during the last decade, as the company has a 3, 5, and 10-year dividend growth rate higher than 10%. Of course, past increases are indicative of future increases, but I would like to see a higher dividend increase from ADP this year to get back on the solid double-digit growth track. The company had two prolonged stretches of very nice dividend growth between 2013 and 2015, and once more between 2018 and 2020. The best dividend increase for ADP during the past decade came in 2018, as the annual dividend increased by 19.66% over the prior year. Next up, we have Amcor plc, that is set to announce its next dividend increase in early November. Amcor doesn't actually have a long dividend growth streak, with history going back to just 2019. So how can this company be a dividend aristocrat? Well, to put it simply, they bought their way in. In 2018, Amcor offered to pay $5.25 billion to acquire Bemis Company, that was a dividend aristocrat. When the transaction went into effect in 2019, Amcor took Bemis's place on the Dividend Aristocrat list and has continued raising its dividend to maintain this lead status. Last year, the dividend rate increased by only 2.16%, and I wouldn't expect any sensational increase this year either, but maybe Amcor will surprise investors. It'll be interesting to see if Amcor will stick with this dividend growth policy in the future and remain a Dividend Aristocrat for years to come. Next up, we have A.O. Smith Corporation, that should announce its next dividend increase in mid-October. The company has a very attractive long-term dividend growth rate in the high double digits. The past 2 years were below par, with the dividend rate increasing by a little more than 8% during each year. An 8% dividend growth rate is still a very nice bump to see from a long-term dividend aristocrat. It's actually better than average when measured against all of the current dividend aristocrats, but we'll get more into that later on in the episode. Next up, we have Atmos Energy, that should announce its next dividend increase in mid-November. Looking at the past decade, the dividend growth rate has been increasing, with the last 4 years all being north of 8%. The long-term 10-year dividend growth rate for Atmos is 6.51%. It would be nice for Atmos to deliver another strong dividend increase later this year and keep this upward momentum going. Next up, we have Becton Dickinson & Company, that should announce its next dividend increase in early November. Becton's dividend growth rate has been declining over the past few years. Earlier in the decade, the company had a good stretch of 4 consecutive years of 10% plus annual dividend growth between 2013 and 2016. Then the growth rate declined to 8.49% in 2017. And it fell down to the 2% range for the following 2 years. In 2020, the dividend growth ticked up a bit, just north of 3%, and last year we saw an even 5% increase. It would be nice to see a strong increase from Becton this year to keep this recent momentum going and improve the long-term dividend growth rate some more. Next up, we have Brown-Forman Corporation, that should announce its next dividend increase in mid-November. Brown-Forman also has a declining dividend growth trend. They had 2 nice dividend growth years in 2013 and 2014, both above 10%. But it's been a downhill ride since then. Last year, the dividend increased by just 3.5%, and I don't think investors should expect a different story this year. Next up, we have Brown & Brown Incorporated, that should announce its next dividend increase in mid-October. The company has decent long-term dividend growth trends in the 7 to 8% range. It did have a nice period of 4 years of double-digit growth between 2014 and 2017, but the last 4 years were all below this magical threshold. Last year, the dividend increase was a solid 9.35%. While not a double-digit bump, it's still a very respectable rate of increase. I'd expect a nice increase this year as well. Maybe not a double-digit hike, but maybe we will see one in the 6 to 9% range once more. Next up, we have Emerson Electric, that should announce its next dividend increase in early November. For the past 6 years, Emerson has only been increasing its dividend by a little more than 1% per year, so I wouldn't set my expectations for anything much higher this year. Surprisingly, the dividend growth trend has been increasing if we compare the 3 and 5 year dividend growth rates, as the 5-year dividend growth rate for Emerson is 1.28%, and the 3-year dividend growth rate is a slightly higher 1.44%. Next up, we have McDonald's that should announce its next dividend increase in late September, so pretty much any day now. McDonald's has a very steady long-term dividend growth rate, with the past 3, 5, and 10-year growth rates all being around 7.5%. Last year, the dividend rate increased by 4.17%, which is lower than the long-term trend, so it's pretty hard to estimate what increase we will see this year based on recent history. We should find out very soon, and if I were to take a guess, I would say it could be in the 4 to 6% range. Next up, we have Nucor that should announce its next dividend increase in early December. Nucor has an increasing dividend growth trend, with the 5-year dividend growth rate being better than the 10-year dividend growth rate, and the 3-year dividend growth rate being better than the 5-year dividend growth rate. Pretty much between 2012 and 2017, the company increased its dividend at a rate of roughly 0.68%. Then the dividend growth rate doubled to 1.82% in 2018, and it doubled once more in 2019 to 4.06%. In 2020, we hit a return to normal, with the dividend hike falling to 0.62%. But last year, the company raised its annual dividend by 6.36%. 2022 was actually a pretty good year for the company, so perhaps we'll see another above-average dividend increase from Nucor later this year. Next up, we have VF Corporation that should announce its next dividend increase in mid to late October. VFC looked solid from a dividend growth perspective early on in the past decade, with a sustained double-digit growth rate between 2012 and 2017. Then things started to sour, with the growth rate falling to a high 9% in 2018 and below 7% in 2019. The past 2 years were pretty awful, with increases of 1.58% and 2.07% respectively in 2020 and 2021. I'd like to see a nicer dividend increase from the company this year, but we will have to wait another month to find out. Next up, we have West Pharma that should announce its next dividend increase in late October. West Pharma has a declining dividend growth rate history, but one that was never fantastic to begin with. The stock doesn't sport an attractive dividend yield, and it isn't a great dividend growth story, but it has historically offered a very high total return. Last year, the company raised its dividend by 6.15%, which was the 6th consecutive year of lower dividend increases. If I were to guess, 2022 might extend this streak to 7 years, and West Pharma will announce a sub 6% dividend hike. And the final aristocrat that should announce a dividend increase this year is Exxon, and that announcement should come in late October. What's interesting is that Exxon actually took a year off from dividend hikes in 2020. Even though the company didn't raise its dividend rate, it maintained Dividend Aristocrat status, as the total amount of dividends paid in 2020 was higher than in 2019. Last year, Exxon raised its dividend by 1 penny right around late October, and this amounted to the annual dividend paid increasing by only 0.29% over the prior year. Exxon technically doesn't need to increase its dividend this year to maintain its aristocrat status. In fact, they could actually even cut their dividend by 2 cents and still show year-over-year growth. I don't think we should be expecting a dividend cut from Exxon, and honestly, I would like to see a dividend hike even if it's just 1 extra penny. So these are the 13 Dividend Aristocrats that will very likely announce a dividend increase before the end of the year. There are 4 more Dividend Aristocrats that should announce a dividend increase this year, but that new dividend rate will likely start in 2023. These companies are Franklin Resources that should announce in mid-December, Ecolab that should announce in early December, McCormick that should announce in late November, and Realty Income that could announce the new quarterly rate in mid-December. The average dividend growth rate for the 51 aristocrats that have already raised their dividends this year is 7.38%. Not all of these 51 aristocrats have declared fourth quarter dividends yet, and it is possible that some may raise dividends again this year. My analysis is based on past trends, and therefore this figure should be relatively accurate, as most companies don't deviate from their increase schedules. In 2021, the average dividend increase for all 64 aristocrats was 6.87%, so while it may look like 2022 is on pace to be better, it actually isn't. If I back out the dividend increases for the aristocrats that have been announced this year from 2021, the average increase last year was 7.41%, which is just slightly higher than this year's average of 7.38%. If we look at the long-term 10-year trend for the aristocrats, dividend growth has actually been declining. A decade ago, the average increases were all in the low double-digit range. They have progressively been dropping lower, with a few exceptions here and there. Another measure I tested was how many double-digit increases there were amongst all 64 aristocrats for each year. In 2013 and 2014, a total of 30 dividend aristocrats had increases of at least 10%. If we look at the past few years, this count has been declining, to just 19 in 2019, 14 in 2020, and 13 last year. In 2020 thus far, we have seen 9 double-digit increases, and the likelihood of seeing 4 more is not very high. There have been 4 exceptionally good dividend increases this year, and they were Lowe's that saw its annual dividend jump by 32.14%, Target that increased its dividend by 25.32%, Cintas that bumped its dividend by 23.53%. Matter of fact, Cintas is the only aristocrat that currently has a perfect 10-year streak of double-digit dividend growth, averaging about 20% per year on average. The final solid dividend increase this year came from Aflac, with a 21.21% increase over 2021. If you're part of my Patreon community, this worksheet that I have been showing is part of the Dividend Aristocrat file I share with the community. If you set up access to the file, you can hop in there right now and check out this worksheet, labeled DGR View, and see the dividend growth history for any Dividend Aristocrat you want. This data is current as of late September, and I'll be updating the worksheet on a monthly basis going forward. If you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate if you gave it a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching and see you next time.